Welcome to Godless and Grounded. Throughout history, human beings have come up with some very unusual ways to connect with the divine, to please gods, or to secure their place in an afterlife. When we look back, many of these practices seem strange, even bizarre, but they made sense to people in their time. What's fascinating is how far people were willing to go in the name of faith. Religion has always shaped human behavior, but in some cases, it shaped it in ways that look downright weird when we step back and look with fresh eyes. Today, we are going to explore some of the strangest religious practices in history. Let's begin with one of the most disturbing and well-known practices in ancient religions: human sacrifice. Across many cultures, from the Aztecs in Mesoamerica to the Carthaginians in North Africa, people believed that the gods demanded human lives. The Aztecs in particular carried out elaborate rituals on top of temples where thousands of captives were sacrificed to ensure that the sun would continue to rise. They thought the blood of humans kept the universe going. Imagine living in a world where the most important thing was not food or shelter, but making sure the gods were fed with human bodies. For us today, it sounds brutal and irrational, but for them, it was normal. This shows just how powerful religious belief can be. Another curious practice is the ancient Hindu ritual of sati, where a widow was expected to throw herself onto her husband's funeral pyre and burn to death. This was seen as an act of devotion, a way to prove loyalty to the husband even after death. It is shocking because it turned grief into an obligation of self-destruction. Although outlawed in India long ago, there are records of it happening even in the 19th century. Imagine being a woman in such a society, told that your value lies not in your own life, but in ending it to honor someone else. This practice reflects how religion often created extreme demands that people felt powerless to refuse. Then we have the flagellants of medieval Europe. During times of plague and disaster, groups of people would march from town to town whipping themselves in public. They believed that by punishing their own bodies, they were atoning for sins and winning God's mercy. The sight must have been both shocking and terrifying. Hundreds of people covered in blood, chanting prayers, convinced that pain could change the course of history. But no amount of whipping stopped the plague. This shows us the desperate lengths people will go when they feel helpless, and when religion convinces them that suffering is holy. In ancient Egypt, another unusual practice was burying servants or family members alive with the dead pharaohs. The belief was that the ruler would need people to serve him in the afterlife, just as he did on earth. So actual living humans were killed and placed in the tombs to accompany him. Later, when this practice was abandoned, Egyptians created figurines and small statues called shabtis to serve the same purpose. This shows that religious imagination could justify not only art and architecture, but also human death as part of ritual. There is also the practice of castration in some religious movements. One example is the Skoptsi sect in Russia during the 18th and 19th centuries. They believed that sexual desire was sinful and that the path to purity was to cut off the genitals. Many men and women in this sect voluntarily mutilated themselves in the belief that they were pleasing God. Another example comes from the early Christian cult called the Church of the Eunuchs, which promoted castration based on certain interpretations of Scripture. These practices are shocking because they reveal how religious belief can override one of the most basic human drives: reproduction. Let's not forget the strange dietary rules found in different religions. From prohibitions on eating pork or beef to fasting for long periods, many traditions built identity through food. But sometimes the practices went beyond simple restriction. For example, in medieval Europe, there were Christian sects that practiced holy anorexia, where women believed starving themselves was a way of purifying the soul and uniting with God. Some saints, like Catherine of Siena, nearly starved themselves to death, refusing all food except the communion wafer. For them, denying the body was the ultimate form of devotion. Today, we would see this as a dangerous eating disorder, but in their time, it was celebrated as holiness. In the Pacific Islands, some tribes practiced ritual cannibalism as part of their religious ceremonies. Eating the flesh of enemies or even relatives was believed to transfer strength, wisdom, or spiritual power. In some cultures, this was seen as the highest honor you could give to the dead, ensuring they lived on inside the community. It is difficult for us to imagine, but for those societies, cannibalism was not evil but sacred. This shows how the line between the holy and the horrific has shifted throughout history. Another strange practice was self-mummification in Japan, carried out by Buddhist monks seeking enlightenment. These monks would slowly starve themselves on a special diet of nuts, roots, and bark while drinking poisonous tea to kill bacteria in their bodies. After years of this process, they would be buried alive in a small stone chamber where they would meditate until death. After several years, the body would be dug up to check if it had naturally mummified. If it had, the monk was declared a saint. If not, the effort was considered wasted. Imagine the determination it would take to prepare for your own death in such a way, all in the hope of eternal recognition. In ancient Mesopotamia, sacred prostitution was practiced at temples dedicated to fertility gods and goddesses. Women, and sometimes men, would offer sexual services in exchange for offerings, with the act itself seen as a religious duty. To modern eyes, this seems contradictory, linking sex with worship. But in those societies, it was believed to bring prosperity and fertility to the land. It reminds us that religious morality has not always been consistent across time. We can also look at bizarre burial customs. Among the Toraja people of Indonesia, there is a tradition where, years after death, bodies are dug up, dressed in new clothes, and paraded around the village in ceremonies called ma'nene. This is done out of respect and to maintain a connection with ancestors. While unusual to us, it reflects how religion and culture often blend to shape practices that keep the dead active in the lives of the living. In ancient Rome, the cult of Cybele practiced rituals that included frenzied dancing, loud drumming, and even ritual castration of male priests. These practices were meant to show complete devotion to the goddess. Outsiders were often horrified by the spectacle, but within the cult, it was seen as the highest act of loyalty. This is yet another example of how religion can push people to extremes that seem incomprehensible to anyone outside the faith. There are also strange examples of animal worship. In some ancient cultures, animals were not only seen as sacred but were treated as actual gods. The ancient Egyptians, for example, worshipped cats to the extent that killing a cat, even by accident, was punishable by death. Temples were dedicated to animal deities, and some animals were even mummified. Today, we keep pets for companionship, but for them, animals were divine beings that held spiritual power. In medieval Europe, relic worship became widespread. Believers traveled long distances to see bones, hair, or even supposed body parts of saints. Some relics were authentic, but many were questionable. There were multiple churches claiming to have the foreskin of Jesus or the milk of the Virgin Mary. People believed these relics held miraculous power, and entire economies grew around selling and displaying them. This practice shows how religion often thrives on material objects that symbolize something greater, even when their authenticity is doubtful. And let's not forget the practice of trial by ordeal, which was common in medieval Christianity. If someone was accused of a crime or heresy, they might be forced to hold a red-hot iron, plunge their hand into boiling water, or be thrown into a river. If they survived unharmed, it was seen as proof that God had protected them. If they died, it was taken as a sign of guilt. Today, we rely on courts and evidence, but back then divine judgment through pain and suffering was considered justice. Even more unusual was the practice of child dedication in certain ancient religions. In Carthage, for example, children were sometimes burned alive as offerings to the god Baal. Archaeological evidence shows burial grounds filled with urns containing the remains of infants. To the parents, this was not cruelty but the highest sacrifice, giving their child to the gods to ensure prosperity for the community. It shows how religious belief can transform the natural love of parents into something unthinkable. One of the more peculiar examples comes from the cargo cults of the South Pacific. These movements developed in the 20th century after indigenous people encountered Western colonizers during World War II. The islanders saw soldiers arrive with vast amounts of goods, food, and technology. With no understanding of modern industry, they assumed these supplies were gifts from the gods. To attract more cargo, they built wooden airplanes, landing strips, and radios made of bamboo, hoping to summon the return of divine supplies. This might seem absurd, but it shows how humans interpret the unknown through religious imagination. Instead of seeing technology as man-made, they explained it with supernatural ideas. Another unusual practice is found in the rituals of the thugs in India, who worship the goddess Kali. For centuries, this secret society engaged in ritualistic killings of travelers, strangling them as offerings to the goddess. They believed that murder was not only a religious duty but a way to maintain cosmic balance. This cult was so widespread that British colonial authorities eventually cracked down on them in the 19th century. Again, religion justified what would otherwise be seen as pure violence. We also cannot ignore the ritual use of hallucinogens in different faiths. From the peyote ceremonies of Native American tribes to the use of ayahuasca in Amazonian shamanism, people have sought visions by consuming mind-altering plants. The belief is that these substances open a door to the divine, letting people see spirits, gods, or cosmic truths. While modern science explains these as chemical effects on the brain, religious traditions saw them as sacred experiences. The weird part is not the visions themselves, but how communities built entire rituals around them, treating hallucinations as divine revelations. In medieval Europe, there was a strange phenomenon called the dancing plague. Groups of people would suddenly begin dancing uncontrollably in the streets, sometimes for days or weeks, until they collapsed from exhaustion or even died. Many at the time thought this was a religious curse or a form of possession. Priests sometimes encouraged the dancers to continue, believing it was a way to purge sin. Today, historians debate whether this was mass hysteria, disease, or psychological stress, but at the time it was understood as a spiritual event. Religion often took mysterious human behavior and gave it supernatural explanations. Another bizarre practice is the ritual of bloodletting found in various cultures. The Maya, for example, would pierce their tongues, ears, or genitals to offer their blood to the gods. This was considered a sacred duty, especially for rulers, whose blood was thought to have special power. Some even used stingray spines or obsidian blades to carry out these rituals. Pain and blood were seen as currency for the gods, proving that devotion often demanded personal suffering. In medieval Christianity, there was also the belief in the power of holy water mixed with unusual substances. Some rituals involved using water that contained pieces of relics, bones, or even powdered saint remains. People believed this water could cure illness, protect them from demons, or bring good fortune. To us, drinking water with powdered bone sounds grotesque, but within the framework of faith, it was seen as miraculous. Moving to Africa, some tribal religions practiced twin infanticide, believing that twins were cursed or represented evil spirits. In some regions, both children were killed immediately after birth. These practices were based on religious fears about supernatural imbalance. While deeply tragic, they remind us how religious ideas often shaped life and death decisions in ways that clash with our modern sense of morality. Another strange ritual comes from the medieval practice of animal trials in Europe. Believe it or not, animals such as pigs, cows, and even insects were put on trial for crimes ranging from theft to murder. They were given legal representation and sometimes executed. Underlying this was the belief that all creatures were subject to divine law and that punishing an animal could restore order. While it sounds absurd today, it shows how deeply religion and law were intertwined. In certain Shinto practices in Japan, dolls were used in rituals to absorb sins. People would transfer their spiritual impurities into the doll and then float it down a river or destroy it. This practice, while harmless compared to others, is fascinating because it shows how tangible objects could be seen as vessels for unseen spiritual burdens. It reflects the human need to make the invisible visible. Another unusual practice is sky burial in Tibetan Buddhism. Instead of burying or cremating the dead, bodies are cut into pieces and left on mountaintops to be eaten by vultures. The belief is that this final act of generosity feeds other living beings and frees the soul from attachment to the body. While shocking to outsiders, it is considered one of the most sacred and practical burial practices in Tibetan culture. In some Polynesian religions, tattooing was not just body art, but a sacred ritual. The process involved extreme pain, and the designs carried deep spiritual meaning. The act of being tattooed was itself a religious journey, transforming the person into a living canvas of divine symbols. In this case, what we see as art was actually an expression of faith. We can also look at medieval European belief in the king's touch. It was thought that monarchs had been chosen by God and could heal diseases like scrofula by simply touching the sick. People traveled long distances just to be touched by a king, believing this contact carried divine power. While we now know it had no medical effect, the belief persisted for centuries, showing how religion and politics often work together to strengthen authority. Another strange example is found in the ritual of scarification practiced in some African and indigenous cultures. Cuts were made on the skin, and ashes or dyes were rubbed into the wounds to create permanent scars. These were not simply decorative, but held religious or spiritual meaning, marking a person as part of a sacred community. The pain was seen as part of the spiritual process, much like fasting or sacrifice. We can also look at the bizarre tradition of relic duplication. As Christianity spread, demand for relics outpaced supply. So many churches claimed to have identical items. Several different churches claimed to possess the true cross of Jesus, the nails from the crucifixion, or even his foreskin. These relics were often displayed for worship, and pilgrims paid money to see them. It shows how religion can turn strange objects into powerful symbols that people would travel and pay for, even when logic suggested fraud. Another oddity is the practice of ritual dancing with snakes in certain Appalachian Christian sects in the United States. Based on a literal reading of a passage in the Bible, believers handle poisonous snakes during services to demonstrate their faith and protection from God. Inevitably, many were bitten, and some died, but the practice continues in some communities. This shows how literal belief in Scripture can lead to dangerous practices. In some ancient Greek rituals, worshippers of Dionysus would engage in ecstatic festivals where they drank heavily, danced wildly, and sometimes tore apart live animals in frenzied states. These rituals were meant to honor the god of wine and ecstasy, but to outsiders they looked like madness. They demonstrate how religious worship could be tied to complete loss of self-control. We can also note the ritual of feet washing in Christianity, which, while not harmful, is unusual. Entire ceremonies are built around washing each other's feet as an act of humility. It seems strange because it focuses on a very specific part of the body, yet it carries deep symbolic meaning within the faith. Another bizarre practice comes from the ghost dance movement of Native American tribes in the late 19th century. Followers believed that if they performed the dance rituals, the spirits of the dead would return, white colonizers would disappear, and the world would be restored to its former state. The movement spread rapidly, showing how hope and desperation can fuel new religious practices even when the promised outcome never arrives. In medieval Europe, people sometimes carried out bizarre penances for sins, such as crawling on their knees for miles, wearing heavy chains, or lying in coffins overnight. These acts were thought to bring forgiveness, showing again how physical suffering was often linked with spiritual cleansing. There are also strange practices surrounding death in different cultures. In some traditions, mourners would hire professional wailers to cry loudly at funerals, believing that the louder the mourning, the more honor was given to the dead. It seems unusual to us, but it reflects how religion often made grief into a public ritual. Even more unusual is the concept of ritual sleep in ancient Greece. People seeking healing would sleep in temples of Asclepius, hoping the god would visit them in dreams and provide a cure. This mix of medicine and religion shows how faith filled the gaps where knowledge was lacking. What all these examples reveal is not only the weirdness of past practices, but also the incredible creativity of human beings when it comes to religion. From human sacrifice to dancing plagues, from self-mummification to relic worship, people have found endless ways to act on their beliefs. Some practices caused great suffering, while others simply expressed devotion in unusual forms. The common thread is that people believed their actions mattered to invisible powers. Whether it was whipping themselves in the streets, building bamboo airplanes, or eating the flesh of their enemies, these practices were never just random. They were shaped by the deep human need to explain the unknown, to control fate, and to feel connected to something greater than ourselves. Looking back, these rituals may appear bizarre, even absurd, but they remind us of the power of belief and how it can shape entire cultures in ways that seem unimaginable today. They also remind us that what seems normal in one era might look strange in another. Someday, future generations may look back at our own religious customs and wonder how we could have believed and practiced them.